From Impact Alpha, it's This Week in Impact, where we bring you some of the most interesting impact investing stories of the week. It's Friday, June 20th. I'm Brian Walsh, and I'm joined this week by Impact Alpha editor David Bang. We'll discuss what the $785 billion private equity giant Apollo has learned 5 years after launching its $1 billion private impact fund. Plus, from the Mastercard Foundation's Africa Growth Fund to local African funders, we'll take a look at the small business investing landscape in Africa. And finally, the Reconstruction will not be televised. A new single drops during Juneteenth week, making the case for shared prosperity. That's all coming up on This Week in Impact. Hi, David. How has your Juneteenth week been this year?
Well, we've been pushing out the single that we're going to have a listen to and making the case for shared prosperity, as you say. So it's been a good Juneteenth.
Well, that's great. Let's get into our first story. First up, our Amy Cortese sat down this week with Joanna Reese, co-head of Apollo Impact Mission, the $1 billion impact fund that represents a small fraction of the overall $785 billion in assets under management for the private equity behemoth Apollo. David, it's been 5 years since Apollo launched Apollo Impact Mission, or AIM, and they've just published their latest impact report. What are we learning?
Well, we've always had a notion that these impact reports are fine for the impact fund, but what about the impact of the firm as a whole? And as you say, Apollo is huge compared to this tiny fund and suffers from some of the ills that plague, some of the rest of the players in the private equity industry. But we also had a theory about, we call it infect the host. I think it sort of fell out of favor during the pandemic. But the metaphor was that these agents of impact inside these bigger financial institutions could, just by the logic of the case, as it were, propagate impact ideas into these bigger pools of capital. And in fact, that's, I think, what the strategy for Apollo's impact platform was. And in that regard, there's some things to report, and that's what Amy's story made note of. I mean, for example, they are part of this Ownership Works consortium that we've talked about in the past. That is a network of private equity players that have committed to sharing ownership with their employees in their companies that they own. Likewise, they've got I think they're $30 billion towards $100 billion goal in clean energy and sustainable investments by 2030, and that's things like community solar and wind power and other things. So that's not in the impact fund. That's in the sort of broader Apollo portfolio. And so, as these kinds of impact investing theses around treating your workers better, around sustainable energy, become kind of mainstream investment theses, Apollo has a lot of firepower to bring to bear on that, and I think that's the opportunity.
All right, so what is their impact approach here? What are the KPIs or the impact measurement and management metrics that they are looking for here?
Well, the holy grail is what's called, collinearity, which is a mouthful, but sometimes gets thought of as the win-wins. It's kind of a little bit different than that. It's essentially meaning that your impact increases along with your business success and along with your revenues, and means that you look for businesses in which that is the case. It's not the case, in every business for all kinds of reasons. But in the cases where it is, you have a nice virtuous circle where either you're saving your customers money in some way by giving them something more efficiently, or you're helping them make money in cases where you're increasing their livelihoods in one way or another. And in that kind of case, where the social impact is growing as your business grows, you can claim that you have your cake and eat it too, as it were. The example they use is a Heritage Grocers Group, which has grocery stores in underserved communities. And Apollo acquired the chain in 2022 and added a couple others in the way that private equity firms do, and created a 115 store chain in low-income communities. And it brings fresh vegetables, and it brings competition and affordable prices to these, to food deserts, or some of which could be food deserts. And so communities eating healthier, grocery businesses doing better revenues, it's everybody's a winner.
Yeah, so it's those win-wins as you talk about, but what about the controversies at Apollo? I mean, the firm has often been in the hot seat for the private equity industry. It was called out in a congressional report earlier this year for prioritizing profits over patients at a hospital owned by its portfolio company, LifePoint Health. And that deal was also featured in the new book from journalist Megan Greenwald's about the private equity industry, Bad Company. So you talked about having these impact funds that will infect the host of the larger financial institutions that they're part of. But what if they also serve as, if you will, impact washing for some other sins in other parts of the business?
Well, that is obviously the fear, and that may in fact be the motivation. I don't know. But the antidote to that, of course, is transparency. And there are plenty of folks, and us included, that do look at the broader private equity landscape, including in this in our new feature LP GP every Tuesday, and we reported out the healthcare report that you mentioned was a Senate report, said they had put profits over patients in a hospital chain that they had bought, and the details of that are interesting. But I think the broader point you're making is that the private equity companies, they're kind of just opportunists, let's just call it that. And if the opportunities cut one way, that's okay. And if they cut the other way, that's another thing. And what the impact funds across all of them, and TPG has through Rise, it has a number of impact funds, and KKR and Bain, and they've all gotten into this, and they does over time dawn on them that there are growth opportunities or value creation opportunities here. Apollo got its start as the king of distressed debt and buying up the corporate paper of previously deals gone bust in one way or another. And they are looking now, as are others, on a landscape where there is lots of distress, including in some sectors that are key to sort of social impact and environmental sustainability. And that's both bad for some of the earlier companies whose deals are not working out, good for companies like Apollo that have dry powder to invest, and also, frankly, then good for the ultimate mission, assuming that folks are stick true to the mission. And if that is delivering clean energy and delivering broad ownership in the companies, and making the quality of jobs better, and a whole kind of sort of uplift strategy that creates value, the private equity firms, they'll go for that strategy because it creates value. So it's a little bit of wishful thinking, but at least the logic is there for this to start to be a big deal.
All right. Well, you can read Amy Cortese's article about Apollo's Impact Fund and what they've learned over the past 5 years on ImpactAlpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. For now, let's take a quick break. When we come back, how the Mastercard Foundation's Africa Growth Fund and local African funders are working to strengthen small business investing in Africa. We had a pair of articles this week from Jessica Pothering and Lucy Ngigi about small business investing in Africa. Jessica looked at lessons learned from the Mastercard Foundation Africa Growth Fund, which is out with a new report looking at its first 3 years of operations, and Lucy reported on the growing number of regional funds of funds investing African money to support African small and medium-sized enterprises. David, let's start with the Africa Growth Fund. What was it designed to do, and what have they learned so far?
Well, it was a big effort, and one of the biggest efforts to date, to commit funding to local African fund managers and investment firms to get money out into the small business community and what's called now growth businesses that I think, as folks are well aware, create the bulk of job opportunities and the bulk of sort of economic growth in most countries, and in particular in African countries. And so they committed nearly $200 million over the time they committed to 16 African fund managers. And as you can imagine, with that kind of money out on the street, as they say, everybody was looking to get an allocation, and so it's been one of the kind of running dramas of the last few years in that world of who was going to be able to get capital from that pool. And there's been a fair amount of pushback about how that in a certain sense distorted the market, and everybody spent a lot of time trying to chase that money, and there was lots of maybe confusion in the marketplace over time. So it's been one of these kind of hidden topics of conversation in the field. And then this week, the Growth Fund itself put out its self-assessment.
All right, let's start with one of their ambitions to really have a strong gender lens investing angle. How did that play out?
Well, that is, a key, and the question is always on gender lens. There's the women as beneficiaries, as customers of the companies and the services and the organizations, and then there's women founders and entrepreneurs, and then up a level there's women fund managers and capital providers. And the thought in the gender lens world, and it makes sense, is that you need to be thinking about all those levels, but how they interrelate is idiosyncratic in many cases. And so the theory perhaps is, women fund managers are more likely to make investments into women entrepreneurs who are more likely to provide goods and services that are, attentive to the needs of women customers. But that's not the only pathway, and maybe those pathways, are not always the right pathways. And so that was one of the tensions that the fund, had to wrestle with.
Yeah, I think another lesson that they learned in the first 3 years of this fund is the need for deep local knowledge, and in the context in which they're operating here. How does that apply?
Yes, standing up local capital providers and building a whole sort of ecosystem, a local ecosystem around investments in small businesses and growing businesses in Africa is a major theme of the report and of the fund, and frankly of the broader efforts that are underway, including in the funds of funds and other mechanisms that are getting stood up in Ghana, in Zambia, and elsewhere. And the notion again is folks close to the ground, to the problems, to the solutions in the networks, knowledgeable about the context in each place, are going to have a better fix on what kinds of investments might actually work out than somebody doing it from London or New York or what have you. And so that said, some of the money comes from London, New York, and elsewhere, and has to get to ground. And what are the pathways for moving that capital? And it's what some folks call the sort of hourglass effect, which is, there's a lot of capital at the top, and then there's a lot of need at the bottom, and then there's this very narrow passage in between.
So how do you thread that needle? So one of the things that I was struck by the report and in my perusal of it was they identified three constructive tensions from the Africa Growth Fund in its first 3 years. And I found these were really applicable kind of across impact investing. So the first constructive tension was confidently executing while learning and adapting. I think that's a challenge that a lot of organizations face. The second, balancing the urgency of direct impact with the ambition to create systems change. I think that resonates with a lot of organizations I'm familiar with. And the third is challenging the norms of the system while working within those norms. I think that's a common refrain that we hear in the impact investing ecosystem.
Yeah, I agreed, and I think all organizations at some level face that. And I think learning from mistakes and feedback is the key thing. And both Mastercard Foundation itself, which is one of the largest foundations in the world, I think after the Gates Foundation, as well as other investors who are coming forward, need to wrestle with all of those things. So at some level, it's all going to be iterative. There's no other choice, and the key is to be able to scale up, because everybody sort of has an understanding where people land on those tensions.
Right. And speaking of scaling up, our next article that Lucy wrote was about local African money in the form of African pension funds and other kind of family offices and other wealth from the continent, backing funds of funds in the region that channel investments into small and medium-sized enterprises. So what are we learning? This is an idea whose time has been a long time coming.
Yeah, indeed. And in fact, you can sort of see it as slow, or you could see it as the breakthrough of long decades of work. But basically, again, local capital providers raising capital from local institutional investors like pension funds, like family offices locally. And so those are going to tend to be fund to funds. Fund to funds are good for defraying risk by increasing the diversification. They've been criticized over time for having multiple layers of fees. So there's mechanisms to sort of take care of that. But it is a way to kind of cross through this narrow part of the hourglass and bring more institutional capital to the kinds of capital providers who can get it out to the small businesses that are the mainstay of the economy. So Sigaba is a fund of funds in Ghana that's getting some traction. There's an interesting development happening in Zambia, where the central bank, as part of a broader kind of restructuring and settlement a few years ago, has put down something like $200 million for a kind of a fund that will incentivize local lenders to lend to a variety of kind of more grassroots and smaller and women-led climate resilient and other kinds of investments. And then Nigeria itself, there's a move on for the pension funds and the government to sort of anchor one of these kind of funds of funds for similar purposes. So starting to be initiatives cropping up all over Africa, all a very good trend, still too small, but kind of maybe a model or a template for what could come next.
All right. Well, you can read Jessica and Lucy's 2 articles on investing in African small businesses on impactalpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. What's your view? You can join in the conversation on our Impact Alpha Slack channel, exclusive for subscribers. But for now, let's take one more quick break. When we come back, the Reconstruction will not be televised. A new single drops during Juneteenth week, making the case for shared prosperity.
The Reconstruction will not be televised. You will not be able to stay in the office, sister and brother. You will not be able to spreadsheet your way to justice. You will not be able to budget your bias, pivot table the pain, quick sort your contrition. No more NASDAQ names hiding subjugation behind the veil of corporate philanthropy. Because the Reconstruction will not be televised. It will be built in commercial co-ops like Chicago. Tenants become stewards, not just renters. It will be governed by those who understand that a vote of confidence carries more value than a vote to control. The Reconstruction will not be televised, but it might be decided in your local church basement this Thursday. In this Reconstruction, you will not be able to ride the acronym railroad of DEI and ESG into glory, not when states blacklist funds for saying the words racial equity, and billionaires buy headlines to denounce restorative finance as woke sabotage. You will not be able to afterpay this Reconstruction, but the Boston Ujima Project will see...
That's a clip from The Reconstruction Will Not Be Televised, a new single that Impact Alpha released this week in celebration of Juneteenth. The song is a new remix of Gil Scott-Heron's 1971 classic, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, reimagined by North Carolina entrepreneur Napoleon Wallace. David, why this song and why now?
Yeah, it's kind of a 5-minute playbook for shared prosperity with a beat, and we released it around Juneteenth, but really around this whole idea of this shared prosperity agenda. In fact, we're going to have our Agents of Impact call next week on policy planks or policy initiatives around shared prosperity. And we're collecting up examples. We've got several dozen examples of bread and butter kinds of strategies that make people's lives better in a kind of, shared prosperity kind of way. And then Napoleon Wallace put new words to the Gil Scott-Heron song and released it. And it's kind of, makes these kinds of maybe wonky strategies, much more accessible. Real estate cooperatives and employee ownership buyouts and the kinds of strategies that we're talking about, but maybe gives it a little pop.
And so how does this song fit into the broader strategy for inclusive economic power? And what comes next for the movement behind the music?
Well, we've been calling it the Reconstruction, and it's construction. So it's both about construction, about building, about the revitalization and the restoration of communities and of livelihoods and of families and individuals. And then, of course, Reconstruction ties back historically to the period right after the Civil War. And thus to kind of Juneteenth is part of that story, where there was a broad-based movement to build kind of multiracial shared prosperity in this country. And it gets remembered sometimes as for the backlash that followed, Jim Crow and everything else. But what we're trying to reclaim with all this is the success in many cases of that model, which again was not any kind of rocket science, social engineering. It was folks just building businesses, building careers, building, educating their kids and finding ways to make things better and growing. And it worked in many, many places, and it persisted throughout not only the South, but in other places for many years, even after the end of formal Reconstruction. So these kinds of ideas are not very complicated, and they're not very radical. I mean, Boston Ujima Project is a kind of community fund with community governance to make investments into kinds of businesses that the community wants to see. Chicago Trend is a kind of real estate cooperative investing mechanism to buy strip malls in neighborhoods, and then folks can own them as well as shop in them and perhaps work in them or start those businesses. The East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative out here in Oakland is buying a multifamily residential and turning it into kind of co-ops and helping kind of preserve affordable housing from gentrification. So these are just kinds of like things that people are doing all over the country, and the song we hope will help kind of rally their spirits, but also help us kind of identify more and give them all a lift in Impact Alpha.
All right, well, you can listen to the full version of The Reconstruction Will Not Be Televised on ImpactAlpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. In the show notes, there's also a link for you to register for our next Agents of Impact call, which will be on Tuesday, June 24th at 10 a.m. Pacific Time, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. But for now, that's going to do it for this episode of This Week in Impact. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Brian.
And thank you all for listening. This Week in Impact is a production of Impact Alpha and part of the Impact Alpha podcast network. Smart conversations by and for impact investing professionals. For exclusive stories and insights about the world of impact investing and sustainable finance, join thousands of other agents of impact by subscribing. Just go to impactalpha.com/subscribe for full access. Thanks, as always, to our producer extraordinaire, the always wonderful Isaac Silk. For David Bank, I'm Brian Walsh, Managing Director of the impact advisory firm Human Nature. We'll see you next week for more Impact.
It gets built block by block, title by title. Reconstruction will not be brought to you by a 5% payout. Philanthropy is on the clock. Foundations will not fund freedom with Monet money that's good from far, but far from good. No more smudging wealth behind plausible deniability. We know what you did last summer. Reconstruction will not be granted. It must be capitalized. That means rethinking who decides and who benefits. Rebalancing portfolios that only prioritize profits with the pain they perpetuate. Take cues from Cataly's Impact First Spin Down or MCF's mission-aligned approach to redistribute power, not just privilege. When asked about fiduciary duty, they point to beneficiaries, not benchmarks. As the gates close, the pivot from perpetuity to the present is a gift. No more infinite timelines, it's a spin down, so the endowment doesn't outlive the people it was meant to serve. But can they also accelerate from 5 to 95 and build an endowment meant to serve the people? The Reconstruction will not be brought to you by Schwab or shown after a shiny, happy ETF ad. It won't be announced on CNBC with a bell, but it will look like the Black Farmer Fund financing new land stewards reclaiming soil and sovereignty. It will sound like a harvest shared, not hoarded. It will be 0% loans governed by farmers themselves, growing not just crops, but control. This is food justice capitalized. You will not have to worry whether to suspect your friends and neighbors if they're still clinging Tyrone, or if this reckoning will actually be Tom's last. But you should worry about the yawning gap between those who believe in scarcity and those who invest in abundance. That gap is being crossed by the seed commons, offering loans repaid only when profits exist, because capital should never punish those least able to bear it. That gap is being closed by new worker owners, thanks to APIS and Heritage, converting plumbing companies and HVAC shops into employee-owned businesses. These conversions don't seek unicorn exits for a few, they build generational exits for many. The Reconstruction won't be publicly traded, but it might be enshrined in your city's budget via $10,000 mom bonds, recommended by activists and capitalized by Next World Assets, because the fiscal justice that low-income kids deserve starts with prenatal care, not pre-K. The Reconstruction is not a metaphor, it is a movement, a method, and it will not be televised because it is not for show. As we mark 160 years since the real Liberation Day was delivered with a musket and a mandate, don't let this 19th be reduced to the federal festive formerly known as Juneteenth. Let it be elevated to a personal reckoning, a chance to tally up what's owed, decide what is necessary, and double down on what's deserved. The Reconstruction is not a branding campaign, it's a blueprint, a battle, a beginning, and it will not be televised, but it will be ours.